funny thing about mothers and fathers. Even when their own child is the most disgusting little blister you could ever imagine, they still think that he or she is wonderful. Thus begins the famous children's book called Matilda by Roald Dahl. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Bayan Book Show, the podcast brought to you by me, Homa Lezgi, and my fellow book lovers here at Bayan Bartar. Now, doesn't the very first line of any book say such a lot about what's in store for you, the reader? And that first line I read out for you at the beginning promises so much, that this is going to be a funny book, that it's unconventional, and most importantly, it's an invitation. It's asking you to step into a world that sounds like it's probably going to make you laugh, gasp, think, maybe even cry. Matilda Wormwood is a genius of a child, teaching herself to read at the age of 3 and devouring all the children's books at the village library by the time she's 4, before moving on to the utter amazement of the remarkably helpful librarian Mrs. Phelps to grown-up books like Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. Now here's Matilda in conversation with the librarian, Mrs. Phelps. Mr. Hemingway says a lot of things I don't understand, Matilda said to her, especially about men and women, but I loved it all the same. The way he tells it, I feel I'm right there on the spot, watching it all happen. A fine writer will always make you feel that, Mrs. Phelps said. And don't worry about the bits you can't understand. Sit back and allow the words to wash around you like music. Now, I read you that passage to make 2 points. 1, how vital libraries and good librarians can be. And 2, how reading one book can open doors to lots and lots of other books and show you how other people experience reading, this very unique human ability that we've come to take for granted. In the words of Roald Dahl, the books transported her into new worlds and introduced her to amazing people who lived exciting lives. She went on olden days sailing ships with Joseph Conrad. She went to Africa with Ernest Hemingway and to India with Rudyard Kipling. She travelled all over the world while sitting in her little room in an English village. I said earlier that with Matilda, we promised from the get-go an unconventional story, and it very much is that. First of all, Matilda's parents not only fail to appreciate her extraordinary brain power and amazing genius, they actively discourage it. And what takes the story to the next level of unconventionality is that Matilda invents various ways to, quote, punish one or both of her parents each time they are beastly to her. But Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood are nothing compared to the headmistress of Matilda's school, the Trunchbull, as she is known, and she's one of the most infamous bullies in children's literature, casually flinging a boy out of a classroom window, or expertly grabbing a girl from her pigtails and swinging her round and round before sending the child sailing like a rocket into the sky. Let's read another part of the book now. It's like a war, Matilda said, overawed. You're darn right it's like a war, Hortensia cried. And the casualties are terrific. We are the Crusaders, the gallant army fighting for our lives with hardly any weapons at all. And the Trunchbull is the Prince of Darkness, the foul serpent, the fiery dragon with all the weapons at her command. It's a tough life. And this reminds us that as children at times we did feel utterly helpless. And that need for justice to prevail is here at long last met. So will Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood finally repent for wronging their own daughter and turn into loving, caring and understanding parents? Oh, but that's too predictable for a Roald Dahl story, isn't it? I'm not going to spoil the ending for you though. I'll just say that it's most probably not what you were expecting, which I guess is a sign of a good book. Matilda, like almost all of Roald Dahl's little heroes and heroines, faces a world replete with adversity, and she has to rely on her own ingenuity to overcome the challenges life throws at her. And this is what children's literature does. It shows us over and over again that we can, that we have the power to change the world. Now let me use the words of the very talented contemporary British writer Catherine Rundell, since she puts it so beautifully and eloquently into words in her essay called Why You Should Read Children's Books Even Though You Are So Old and Wise. Children's fiction offers to help us re-find things we may not even know we have lost. When you read children's books, you are given the space to read again as a child, to find your way back to the time when new discoveries came daily and when the world was colossal, before your imagination was trimmed and neatened as if it were an optional extra. That mental image of something being trimmed and neatened like a great mop of hair or like the wings of a bird, it's very poignant when you think how you may be clipping the very things that make you fly. In one of his interviews, Roald Dahl says, "I am totally convinced that most grown-ups have completely forgotten what it is like to be a child between the ages of 5 and 10. I can remember exactly what it was like. I am certain I can." And I think the most successful children's writers are those who do feel that way, and that's probably why children immediately connect with their words. Speaking about some of the children's books she likes, Matilda tells her teacher, Miss Honey, that she thinks all children's books ought to have funny bits in them. Children are not so serious as grown-ups, and they love to laugh, Matilda says. Now, I know we as grown-ups also usually love to laugh, but we have our inhibitions and restrictions, don't we? How many times can you remember feeling slightly uncomfortable when children go on laughing while you think it's appropriate for them to stop, or when they laugh too loudly for your liking? It's the same with imagination. As kids, we believe in magic. As grown-ups, we look for reason. And above all, watch with glittering eyes, Roald Dahl says somewhere else, the whole world around you, because the greatest secrets are always hidden in the most unlikely places. Those who don't believe in magic will never find it. And that brings us almost to the end of this episode, but before we close our book, I'd also like to mention that 30 years after Matilda's publication, the illustrator, Quentin Blake, imagined what Matilda might be doing as a grown-up woman today. And my question to you is just that. How do you think Matilda's future would have panned out? What would she be doing as a grown-up? Now, before I say goodbye, a few words about this brand new podcast. It's called the Bayan Book Show. Its purpose is reading together and discussing what we've read and how it's affected us. I'll be announcing a single book at the end of each show, and you'll have time to read it until the next episode drops. So if you have any book recommendations, if you loved a book you recently read and would like us to talk about it, please let us know. Our next book is one that I very recently finished reading, What I Talk About When I Talk About Running by Haruki Murakami. If you haven't read it or even heard of it, here's the perfect excuse to start reading. And if you have, maybe you'd like a reread to delve deeper before our upcoming discussion. Until next time, happy reading.